Germany's wonder weapon that arrived too late. The year is 1944. The skies over the Third Reich have become a sprawling, unending graveyard. For 5 long years, the war has raged, but now it has come home to Germany with a vengeance that is both breathtaking and absolute. Day and night, without pause, the industrial heart of the Reich is being systematically pulverized. By day, the American 8th Air Force arrives in vast, glittering formations of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators, sometimes 1,000 strong. By night, the British RAF Bomber Command takes over, their Lancasters and Halifaxes guided by the raging fires lit by the Americans hours before. They are escorted by swarms of long-range fighters, most terrifyingly the P-51 Mustang, a thoroughbred killing machine that has turned the Luftwaffe's own backyard into a lethal hunting ground. The once mighty Luftwaffe, the sharp spearhead of the blitzkrieg that had terrified Europe, is now a ghost of its former self. It has been bled dry of its best and most experienced pilots, starved of fuel by a relentless bombing campaign against its oil refineries, and is now forced to send half-trained boys into the sky to face battle-hardened Allied veterans. They can do little to stop the onslaught. For every Allied bomber that falters and spirals down in a plume of black smoke, 10 more seem to take its place, their drone a constant, unshakable funeral dirge for a dying nation. The war is lost, and anyone with eyes on the ground or in the sky can see it. But then a new sound begins to tear across the heavens. It's a sound unlike anything ever heard before, not the familiar, throaty roar of a piston engine, but a piercing, high-pitched scream like a banshee's wail. It's the sound of the future. Allied pilots, cruising in the frigid air high above Germany, would catch a glimpse of a shark-like shape with no propeller, a predatory silhouette that flashed past them at speeds that seemed to defy the laws of physics. It would appear as if from nowhere, unleash a devastating hail of cannon fire that could shred a 4-engine heavy bomber in seconds and then vanish, climbing away at a rate that left pursuers frozen in its wake. It left only shock, confusion, and burning wreckage behind. This was the Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Codenamed the Schwalbe or Swallow by its pilots who saw it as a graceful interceptor, it was a weapon that felt like science fiction in the grim reality of 1944. It represented a quantum leap in aviation, a machine so profoundly advanced it outclassed every single aircraft the Allies could put in the air. On paper, this was the weapon that could have swept the skies clean of the Allied fighter screen, shattered the bomber offensive, and maybe, just maybe, altered the final, bloody outcome of the Second World War. So why didn't it? Why did this technological marvel, this so-called wonder weapon, ultimately fail to make a strategic difference? The answer is a dramatic and cautionary tale of innovation and self-destruction. It isn't just a story of groundbreaking German engineering, but one of crippling arrogance at the highest levels of command, of catastrophic mismanagement of resources, and the obsessive, ruinous meddling of one man, Adolf Hitler. This is the story of the jet that arrived too late. Imagine you're an Allied bomber pilot in the late autumn of 1944. You're 25,000 feet in the air, deep inside enemy territory, encased in a metal tube that feels both immensely powerful and terrifyingly fragile. Your entire world is a constant, deafening roar of 4 radial engines and the biting, relentless cold of the upper atmosphere that seeps through the fuselage. You are surrounded by hundreds of other B-17s, a massive city of aluminum and plexiglass moving through the sky, but you have never felt more alone. Your gaze is fixed, scanning the blue expanse for the tiny black dots that signal incoming enemy fighters. Suddenly, your fighter escorts, the P-51 Mustangs that are your lifeline, your guardian angels, are calling out in disbelief over the radio. Their voices are laced with a new kind of alarm. Something is attacking the formation, moving at speeds they can't possibly match. Before you or your gunners can react, a sleek, predatory aircraft with swept-back wings and no propellers is on you. It's moving nearly 120 miles per hour faster than the fastest Mustang escort. It doesn't engage in a dogfight, it executes a pass. It doesn't just shoot at you, it erupts. 4 30mm cannons housed in its nose unleash a torrent of explosive shells, each one the size of a milk bottle. A single 1-second burst is often enough to tear a 4-engine heavy bomber apart, shearing off a wing or disintegrating a tail section. You see a fortress ahead of you simply cease to exist, replaced by a blossom of orange flame and a cloud of falling debris. The attacker is gone before your gunners can even draw a bead. B-17 gunner John Quinlan, who witnessed these horrific attacks firsthand, had a simple, chilling name for the aircraft: a demon. This was the promise of the Me-262. It was a fighter so advanced it felt like it came from another planet, an instrument of war that could have restored the Luftwaffe's dominance. But that promise was a paradox. For all its revolutionary potential, the Me-262 was a weapon crippled from within. Long before it ever saw a battlefield, its story is one of German genius being systematically undone by German leadership, a saga of what might have been, lost in a storm of hubris, incompetence, and desperation. To truly understand the revolution that was the Me-262, you have to understand the man who arguably embodied the spirit, the skill, and the frustrations of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, Adolf Galland. A brilliant and charismatic ace with over 100 aerial victories, Galland was a living legend. By 1944, he was Germany's General of Fighters, a powerful position that put him in direct command of the air defense of the Reich. In early 1943, he was invited to the Messerschmitt test facility at Lechfeld to fly an early prototype of the Me-262. The experience changed him forever. He would later write in his memoirs that flying the jet felt as though he were being pushed by angels. It was not a technical description, but a poetic one, a feeling that captured the sheer, otherworldly leap in performance the jet represented. For a man who had mastered piston-engine combat, this was something new, something magical. He had seen the future, and he knew it was Germany's only hope. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, locked in a brutal, attritional, and losing battle for survival over its own homeland. The single greatest threat was the U.S. 8th Air Force's daylight strategic bombing campaign. Formations of up to 1,000 B-17s and B-24s would march across the sky, protected by an ever-growing screen of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts. The arrival of the long-range P-51 in late 1943 had been the final nail in the coffin for the Luftwaffe's old tactics. German fighters could no longer attack the bombers with impunity. They now had to fight their way through a hornet's nest of superior Allied fighters just to get a glimpse of their primary targets. The German piston-engine fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf Sum 09 and the Focke-Wulf FW 190, were still excellent aircraft, but they were being pushed to their absolute limits and beyond. To even reach the high-flying bombers, they had to fight their way through swarms of American escorts that held the advantage in numbers, overall performance at high altitude, and pilot quality. If a German pilot was skilled or lucky enough to break through the fighter screen, he then faced a moving wall of defensive fire from hundreds of 50-caliber machine guns. It was a meat grinder. The Luftwaffe was losing experienced pilots and essential aircraft at a rate it simply couldn't sustain. Training programs were slashed from months to mere weeks, sending young, inexperienced pilots with less than 200 total flying hours to their deaths against Allied veterans with thousands of hours in their logbooks. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out, and its leaders knew it. Into this desperate situation came the Me-262. Its performance statistics were breathtaking, almost unbelievable for the time. It could achieve a top speed approaching 560 miles per hour, while the P-51 Mustang, arguably the best all-around Allied fighter of the war, topped out around 440 mph. This speed advantage wasn't just a small step up, it was a whole new paradigm of air combat. An Me-262 pilot could dictate the terms of any engagement. He could engage at will and, more importantly, disengage at will. Allied fighters were simply too slow to catch it in a straight chase or a climb. If an Me-262 pilot found himself in trouble, he could simply push the throttle forward and leave the enemy behind. Its armament was just as revolutionary. While Allied fighters typically carried 6 or 8 50-caliber machine guns, superb for dogfighting but requiring hundreds of hits to bring down a heavy bomber, the Me-262 packed a devastating punch with 4 30mm MY-108 cannons clustered in its nose. These were not high-velocity guns designed for aerial duels. They were essentially low-velocity mine-throwers, firing heavy, explosive-filled shells. German pilots claimed that just 3 or 4 direct hits could be enough to completely disintegrate a bomber's wing or sever its tail. This was a bomber killer, pure and simple. Later in the war, as if the cannons weren't enough, the Me-262 was also fitted with underwing racks of 55mm R4M air-to-air rockets. A pilot could fire a salvo of 24 of these unguided projectiles into the tight formations of Allied bombers from outside the effective range of the bomber's defensive guns. This created a shotgun-like blast of explosives and shrapnel over a wide area, designed to break up the disciplined formations and leave individual bombers damaged and vulnerable to follow-up attacks with the cannons. To Adolf Galland and other forward-thinking officers, the Me-262 looked like a miracle. They envisioned wolf packs of these jets, untouchable by the Mustang escorts, slicing through the bomber streams at will and inflicting such crippling losses that the Allies would be forced to call off their daylight raids. This, they believed, would give Germany the breathing room it desperately needed to rebuild its forces and perhaps even negotiate a stalemate. The potential was there. The technology was real. But the path from a revolutionary prototype to a war-winning weapon would be sabotaged by disastrous decisions that began years before the first Me-262 ever saw combat. The story of the Me-262 doesn't start in the desperation of 1944, but in the innovative, competitive, and often chaotic world of German aviation research in the late 1930s. The idea of jet propulsion wasn't new. Brilliant pioneers in both Britain and Germany were independently working on this revolutionary concept. In Germany, a young physicist named Hans von Ohain, backed by the industrialist Ernst Haeckel, had already achieved a stunning world first. On August 27, 1939, just days before the invasion of Poland ignited World War II, the Heinkel He-178 became the world's first purely jet-powered aircraft to fly, its single He-3 engine whining over the skies of Marienhehe. Germany had a clear, undeniable head start. Despite this early lead, the German Air Ministry, the Reichsluftfahrtministerium or RLM, showed a puzzling and ultimately catastrophic lack of urgency. The top brass, men like the flamboyant and bombastic Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring and his deputy, the brilliant but deeply flawed Ernst Udet, were entirely focused on the immediate needs of the German army's Blitzkrieg doctrine. They wanted tactical bombers to support ground troops and short-range fighters to achieve quick, local air superiority. The war, they confidently believed, would be a series of short, sharp campaigns. Long-term, high-risk, high-cost research into unproven technologies like jet engines was seen as a frivolous distraction and a waste of precious resources. In a moment of supreme short-sightedness, Göring himself actually cut funding for jet engine development in early 1940, shrinking the core engineering team to just 35 people. Thankfully, a few visionaries inside the ministry, men like Helmut Schelp and Hans Mauck, recognized the long-term potential and kept pushing behind the scenes. In 1938, they had quietly issued a specification for a jet fighter, asking the Messerschmitt Company to begin design work on a project designated P-11065. But the real heart of the Me-262, and the source of nearly all its subsequent troubles, was its engines. The German engineering teams at Junkers and BMW made a fateful decision. Instead of pursuing the simpler, more robust centrifugal flow design being developed by Britain's Frank Whittle, they opted for a new, more advanced, and far more complex design: the axial flow turbojet. This design, which would eventually become the Junkers Jumo 004 and the BMW 003, promised to be slimmer, lighter, and ultimately more powerful than its centrifugal counterpart. It was, without a doubt, the engine of the future, but building it in the 1940s was a technical nightmare. The core of a jet engine operates at temperatures and pressures that were almost unimaginable at the time. The turbine blades, spinning thousands of times a minute, are subjected to immense centrifugal forces and searing heat that would melt normal steel in an instant. They required advanced metal alloys using materials like nickel, cobalt, and molybdenum, strategic metals that Germany had in very short supply and would be almost entirely cut off from once the war began in earnest. This critical shortage of high-temperature alloys would haunt the entire program from beginning to end. Developing the Jumo 0004 and BMW 03 engines was a slow, painful, and frustrating process, marked by countless failures, explosions, and redesigns. The Messerschmitt design team, under Waldemar Voigt, had a flyable airframe ready remarkably early, but the promised jet engines were nowhere to be found. The first prototype, the Me-262 V1, actually made its maiden flight on April 18, 1941. Powered by a single Junkers Jumo 210 piston engine, mounted in its nose, simply to test the airframe's flight characteristics. Later that year, when they finally installed the highly experimental BMW-03 jet engines on the wing pods, they wisely chose to keep the propeller engine on the nose as a safety measure. It was a good thing they did. During that first flight with the jets, both engines failed spectacularly shortly after takeoff, and the test pilot, Fritz Wendell, had to use the old-school prop to limp back to the ground and save the precious prototype. It wasn't until July 18, 1942, that the Me-262 V3 prototype finally flew purely on jet power, equipped with the new Jumo 004 engines. That was more than a year after the airframe itself had first flown. A full year, an eternity in wartime, had been lost to the immense difficulty of building reliable jet engines from substandard materials. Even then, the problems were far from solved. To mass-produce the engines, German engineers had to perform acts of desperate ingenuity. The production version, the Jumo 004B, was a marvel of compromise. It used hollow, air-cooled turbine blades made from an inferior steel alloy plated with aluminum to resist oxidation. It was a clever workaround, but it came at a terrible cost: reliability and longevity. The service life of an early Jumo 004 engine was a shocking 10 to 25 hours. For an experienced pilot who treated the throttle with extreme care, it might last that long. For a novice, it could fail on the very first flight. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a logistical catastrophe built into the very heart of Germany's wonder weapon, ensuring that most of them would be grounded, awaiting engine changes that would never come. The two crucial years between the Me-262's first successful all-jet flight in July 1942 and its eventual combat debut in mid-1944 are a painful case study in how to squander a miracle weapon. The air war was turning decisively against Germany. These were 2 years when even a small fleet of Me-262s could have made a real, tangible difference. Instead, the program languished, starved of priority, and plagued by technical setbacks. A significant part of the delay was absolutely the engine problems. The Jumo 04 was fragile, temperamental, and demanded a whole new way of flying. Unlike a piston engine that responds almost instantly, early jets suffered from a serious throttle lag. Slamming the throttle forward too quickly could flood the combustion chamber with fuel, causing the engine to overheat and the turbine blades to fail. Chopping the throttle back too fast could cause the flame to go out, a flameout, from which it was nearly impossible to restart in the air. Pilots had to learn to nurse the throttle gently, a delicate touch that was completely counterintuitive in the heat of combat. This made the jet incredibly difficult and dangerous to handle, especially during the low-speed, high-power situations of takeoff and landing. But the technical problems were made infinitely worse by a stunning lack of vision and priority from the top. In 1942, and even deep into 1943, the Nazi high command, including Goering and Hitler himself, still believed they could win the war with the planes they already had. They failed to grasp the jet's revolutionary potential, viewing it as a curiosity rather than a war-winning necessity. Production priority, steel, and skilled labor remained firmly with the proven Bf-109 and FW-190 fighters. The program was perpetually delayed by a lethal combination of genuine technical difficulty and official indifference. The most infamous delay, however, came from the direct intervention of one man, Adolf Hitler. In late November 1943, the Me-262 was demonstrated for the Führer at a military airfield in Insterburg, East Prussia. Impressed by its incredible speed, Hitler turned to designer Willy Messerschmitt and asked a single, fateful question: can this aircraft also carry bombs? Messerschmitt, a skilled industrialist but also an opportunist eager to please the dictator, immediately replied that it could. He claimed the airframe was strong enough to carry two 550-pound bombs, or even a single 100-pound bomb. That was all Hitler needed to hear. By this stage of the war, his thinking had become pathologically fixated on offensive vengeance weapons. He saw the Allied bombers raining destruction on German cities not as a strategic threat to be defeated with interceptors, but as a personal insult to be answered with attacks on Allied soil, or on the Allied beachheads he knew were coming in France. He didn't see a pure fighter, a swallow, to hunt and destroy bombers. He envisioned a Schnellbomber, a fast bomber that could streak past enemy defenses and deliver its payload with impunity. In May 1944, during a conference where he learned that the Me-262 was being readied for mass production only as a fighter, Hitler flew into a volcanic rage. He felt he had been personally disobeyed. He issued a direct, unequivocal order. The Me-262 was to be produced solely as a fighter bomber. Every single one had to be capable of carrying bombs. There would be no exceptions. The designers and senior Luftwaffe officers were horrified. Adolf Galland, who was present at the meeting, argued passionately against the decision. He knew that using the Me-262 as a bomber was a gross misuse of its unique talents. The modifications themselves weren't massive, but they were critical. The external bomb racks added weight and drag, cutting into the jet's all-important speed advantage and making it more vulnerable to Allied fighters. The cockpit had no proper bomb sight, making accurate level bombing from a high-speed jet nearly impossible. It would be a blunt, inaccurate instrument. Most critically, Hitler's order caused months of chaos, redesigns, and bureaucratic confusion, just as production was finally meant to be starting in earnest. Precious engineering resources were wasted developing the Sturmvogel, Stormbird, bomber variant instead of perfecting the Schwalbe fighter. While the engine problems were a huge underlying factor in the Me-262's late arrival, Hitler's obsession with the bomber role was a massive, self-inflicted wound at the worst possible moment. The clock was ticking down to Germany's final defeat, and Hitler had just wasted precious, irreplaceable time. By the summer of 1944, Germany's strategic situation was dire. The D-Day landings in Normandy on June 6th had succeeded, and a massive Allied army was breaking out into France. The Soviet war machine was crushing German armies on the Eastern Front, pushing relentlessly toward the borders of the Reich. And the Allied bomber offensive continued its work, day after relentless day. It was into this collapsing world that the Me-262 finally arrived in small numbers to the front lines. The first significant combat encounter happened in late July 1944. An Me-262, flown by Lieutenant Joachim Weber, attacked a high-flying, unarmed British de Havilland Mosquito photo reconnaissance plane over the skies of Munich. The Mosquito was one of the fastest propeller-driven aircraft of the war, famous for its ability to outrun anything the Luftwaffe could send after it. Its pilot was shocked to find the German jet easily closing the distance, its cannons blazing. Though the Mosquito, through skillful maneuvering, managed to escape into cloud cover, the message was clear. A new era of air combat had begun. Soon, a special test unit, a Probungskommando 262, was formed to develop combat tactics. It was later renamed Kommando Nowotny, after its famous ace commander, the 258 victory Austrian ace, Major Walter Nowotny. The results from this unit were both electrifying and deeply troubling. For Allied bomber crews, the Me-262 was an object of pure terror. Reports flooded in from stunned pilots describing a plane of unbelievable speed and destructive power. A P-51 pilot might be patrolling high above the bomber stream, only to see a grey streak flash through their formation, fire a devastatingly accurate burst, and then disappear in a vertical climb before he could even think about turning to engage. The tactics developed were brutal and effective. The jets were too fast for traditional turning dogfights. Instead, they used their superior speed and energy. A favorite tactic was the roller coaster attack. The jets would dive through a bomber formation from above and behind, a high-angle, high-speed pass that gave the bomber gunners only a second or two to react. After firing their cannons, the jets would use their immense kinetic energy to zoom back up to a safe altitude, far out of reach of the escorting fighters, before setting up another attack. When armed with the R-4M rockets, the effect was even more devastating. On March 18, 1945, in one of the largest jet actions of the war, 37 Ma-262s from Yugoslavia 7, JG-7, attacked a massive formation of over 1,200 American bombers and their 600-plus fighter escorts. They fired their rockets from outside the effective range of the bombers' machine guns, a coordinated volley that broke up the tight, disciplined defensive formations. Then, they tore through the scattered and vulnerable bombers with their 30mm cannons. On that day, the jets claimed 12 bombers and 1 fighter destroyed, for the loss of only 3 Me-262s. It was a stunning tactical victory and a terrifying glimpse of the jet's true potential. The Luftwaffe formed dedicated jet fighter wings like JG-7. Even more famous was Jagdverband 44, JV-44, a special squadron formed in the final, chaotic months of the war by Adolf Galland himself. After repeatedly clashing with Goering over strategy, Galland had been fired as General of Fighters. Goering had taunted him to go and prove the jet's potential himself. Galland did just that. He created an elite unit comprised of Germany's highest-scoring surviving aces, men like Johannes Steinhoff, Gerhard Barkhorn, and Walter Krupinski, a group nicknamed the Squadron of Experts. Flying from makeshift airfields under constant threat of attack, these masters of air combat showed what the Me-262 could do in the right hands, achieving an impressive, though strategically meaningless, 4-to-1 kill ratio in the war's final weeks. For a brief, terrifying moment for the Allies, the thunder of jet engines brought a new kind of fear to the skies over Germany. The what-if scenario seemed tantalizingly real. What if thousands of these jets, flown by these experts, had been available a year or two earlier? It was a question that haunted Allied commanders, but this frightening vision would be shattered by the harsh reality of a nation on the very brink of total collapse. The combat successes of the Me-262 were dazzling flashes of brilliance in a sea of overwhelming dysfunction. For every story of an ace tearing through a bomber formation, there were a dozen untold stories of catastrophic mechanical failure, fatal pilot error, and logistical collapse. The wonder weapon had more than one Achilles heel, and the Allies, with their overwhelming numerical and logistical superiority, would learn to exploit every single one. The biggest, most fundamental flaw was still the engines. The Jumo 04s were a maintenance nightmare. With a service life that often measured in single-digit hours, engine changes were a constant, crippling burden. For every hour an Me-262 spent in the air, it spent many more on the ground, surrounded by mechanics performing Herculean tasks with dwindling resources. Many jets were lost, not to enemy fire, but to engine flameouts on takeoff, turbine failures in flight, or fires on landing. As Germany's armaments minister Albert Speer astutely noted, they could figure out how to mass-produce the plane's advanced airframe, but they could never build enough reliable engines to power them. Then there was the critical, and by 1944, unsolvable shortage of properly trained pilots. Flying a jet wasn't like flying a Bf-109. It required a delicate touch, forward planning, and a whole new set of tactics to manage its speed and its temperamental engines. But by late 1944, the Luftwaffe's training program had all but fallen apart. Green novices, with only a handful of hours on piston engine trainers, were being thrust into the cockpit of the world's most advanced and unforgiving fighter. With no dedicated two-seat trainers available for much of the program, a pilot's first solo flight in a Me-262 was often a deadly gamble. Hundreds of these priceless aircraft were destroyed in takeoff crashes, landing accidents, and training mishaps before they ever saw an enemy. The Allies, for their part, were not just sitting back and watching. They were pragmatic, and they adapted quickly. Allied intelligence and pilot feedback rapidly identified the new threat's weaknesses. They knew they couldn't outrun the jet or outclimb it. So, they decided not to fight it on its terms. They identified its greatest vulnerability. It was slow, clumsy, and utterly defenseless during its long takeoff runs and its flat-powered landing approaches. This led to the brutally effective rat-catching tactic. Allied fighter groups, especially P-51 Mustang and British Hawker Tempest squadrons, would deliberately ignore the high-altitude bombers and instead orbit menacingly over known Me-262 airfields. They would lie in wait, sometimes for hours, for the jets to return from their sorties, low on fuel and with their throttles at low power. As the jets slowed for their final approach, throttles back and wings dirty with flaps and landing gear down, the Allied fighters would pounce from above. In this state, the Me-262 was helpless. The hunters became the hunted, right over their own homes. To protect their precious jets, the Germans had to resort to using their best remaining propeller fighters, like the excellent FW-190D9, to fly protective cover over their own airfields, a defensive, reactive posture that ceded the skies everywhere else to the Allies. The final, insurmountable problem was the total collapse of the German war economy. The Allied strategic bombing campaign had shifted its focus in mid-1944 to destroying Germany's synthetic fuel plants and its transportation network. The effect was devastating. There were documented cases of Me-262s, the most advanced aircraft in the world, being towed to the runway by teams of oxen because there was no gasoline for the ground crew's trucks and tractors. Spare parts, replacement engines, and vital ammunition often failed to reach the frontline units, stuck in bombed-out rail yards or on roads strafed daily by Allied fighter bombers. Of the more than 1,400 Me-262s that were ultimately produced, it's estimated that fewer than 300 ever saw combat at any one time. On any given day, in the spring of 1945, the number of jets actually mission-ready to fly was likely no more than a few dozen. A handful of technological marvels thrown against an Allied air armada that numbered in the thousands. The sky was full of thunder, but it was the thunder of Allied engines. The revolutionary scream of the Me-262 was already fading into history. The story of the Me-262 is a powerful and timeless lesson in how brilliant technology is never enough. It can be defeated by bad strategy, crippled by internal fighting, and squandered by failed leadership. It's a theme you see again and again in military history, a reminder that the human element, from the factory floor to the high command, is always the most critical component. If you enjoy stories that connect technology, tactics, and the people behind them, consider subscribing to the channel. We explore these incredible histories every week, and your support helps us bring them to life. By May 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled into ruin, the remaining Me-262s were being gathered on their airfields and systematically blown up by their own crews to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The wonder weapon had failed. Its impact on the final outcome of World War II was, in the end, negligible. The reasons for this failure are a tragic list of what-ifs. A revolutionary airframe was hopelessly crippled by underdeveloped and unreliable engines. Indifference and short-sightedness from the top cost precious years of development when the jet could have made a difference. Hitler's obsessive, ill-informed meddling with the bomber version caused disastrous delays at the most critical moment. And by the time the planes finally reached the front in any numbers, Germany lacked the fuel to fly them, the pilots to master them, the mechanics to maintain them, and the airfields to protect them. And yet, the story of the Messerschmitt 262 doesn't end in the rubble of 1945. As Allied forces overran Germany, special intelligence units like the American Operation Lusty raced to capture Germany's advanced aeronautical technology, and the Me-262 was at the very top of their list. Captured jets were carefully disassembled, crated up, and shipped to the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, where they were meticulously reassembled, studied, and flown by Allied test pilots. The influence of this German jet on the next generation of aircraft was both immediate and profound. The Me-262 had pioneered a combination of features that would become standard on the next generation of fighters: a tricycle landing gear, a heavy cannon-based armament, and most visibly, swept wings. While the 262's own wings had only a slight sweep, added mainly to correct the airframe's center of gravity, the aerodynamic data collected by German researchers like Adolf Busemann on the benefits of wing sweep for high-speed flight was captured along with the hardware. This research proved invaluable. The American F-86 Sabre and the Soviet MiG-15, the two iconic jets that would duel for supremacy over the skies of Korea just a few years later, both owed a clear and direct design heritage to the research that produced the Me-262. They were, in essence, the children of a failed German wonder weapon. The Messerschmitt 262 stands as one of history's great and most fascinating paradoxes. It was both a spectacular failure and a monumental success. It failed utterly to save the murderous regime that created it, but it succeeded in defining the very future of military aviation. It was the closing chapter of propeller-driven combat and the explosive first chapter of the jet age, written in the final, fiery days of the Second World War. It was the weapon that lost the war but won the future of flight.